It's Sunday, the 22nd of October, 2006. This is Vegan Freak Radio number 51.
Vegan Freaks, it's Jenna.
And Bob. And we're coming at you again with another episode of Vegan Freak Radio.
Yes, and this one should be, the entire thing is basically going to be an interview.
Basically,
I turned Southern there for a second. I don't know what happened.
It's like AI. Basically, it was like spelled B-A-I.
I think I was going to start to say something else, and then I changed my mind.
Yeah. Well, the whole week will, in fact, be an interview. The next two shows are both going to be full interview shows. We're taking a somewhat more serious turn with Vegan Freak Radio. Not that we're never serious. We are serious on occasion, but
we do have our serious moments, indeed.
We do, but we have recently had the opportunity to talk to Lee Hall and the work that Hall does with Friends of Animals and Hall's newest book, which is called Capers in the Churchyard. So we sat down and had a very long conversation today with Lee, and we're going to play that conversation for you in a moment. Next week, though, the show will also be probably an hour and a half long, also a straight interview, this time with Gary Francione, who is professor of law at Rutgers University and author of innumerable books, articles, and other things that deal with issues of abolition and animal rights. And Gary Francione's work has really influenced the way in which I think about animal rights and the way in which I think about abolitionism. And we're very much looking forward to having him on the show next week. This week, though, we've got Lee Hall on the show. Lee Hall wrote Capers in the Churchyard. Lee Hall works with Friends of Animals. Lee Hall is a lawyer. What else?
Yeah, and does a lot of writing for Friends of Animals publications,
right,
and their website and everything. And I think it's a really interesting interview. We talk a lot about different issues and aspects of the movement, and I think that'll come up next week as well in our interview with Gary Francione. What should the movement look like? What does being vegan mean? What does abolition mean? And these are important conversations. And this also a question of conversing about these kinds of things comes up in the interview this week.
Yeah,
and I think it's really important for the movement to talk about what is the movement.
I think so too. And this week, our interview with Lee, we go into so many different topics. And, I really enjoy talking with Lee because although I don't agree 100% with what Lee says on a lot of issues, we had a very interesting conversation that worked off of some of that, back and forth a little bit. I enjoyed that, actually. So we talk about the movement. We talk about welfarism, or what Hall would call husbandry. We just talk about a whole variety of things.
Yeah, so why don't we just let the interview roll?
Yeah, so the interview is about an hour and 10 minutes long. We'll let the interview roll. We'll be back right at the end of that interview to close out the show. And sit back, put on your thinking cap, pay attention, and call us with comments at 267-295-1944 or email us at podcast@veganfreak.com. We would love to hear your comments and thoughts on the interview. And be in touch, because we do like to get audience feedback, and we should be having bigger conversations about these things, so no reason we couldn't include all of you out there as well.
Indeed.
So here's our interview with Lee Hall, who is a lawyer and animal advocate and associated with Friends of Animals. Enjoy. Okay, we're here with Lee Hall, and Lee Hall is a lawyer, teacher, and advocate with 2 decades of volunteer and independent experience before becoming the legal director for Friends of Animals and writing the column Movement Watch, which tracks trends in animal activism. Lee Hall's work also appears in Legal Times, Dissident Voice, and the Encyclopedia of Activism and Social Justice. And it is our great pleasure to have Lee Hall on the show. Lee also has recently written a book called Capers in the Churchyard, Animal Rights Advocacy in the Age of Terror, and we're going to talk about this book and a whole bunch of other things today on the show. Welcome to the show, Lee.
Hi, thank you, Bob.
And I guess to begin with, it would be interesting to kind of hear your basic ideas that you bring forward in Capers in the Churchyard.
Well, as I was writing the book, actually this came out of a discussion that we had some time ago with Southern Poverty Law Center. I think you'll probably remember that the Southern Poverty Law Center got very concerned about animal activists, and particularly the idea that animal activists maybe, in some cases, some groups, may be acting like hate groups. And the way the Southern Poverty Law Center wrote up this idea really concerned us, because we thought, well, they're writing about a specific sector of thought, but not really going into talking about, how the people feel about what they've done. And mainly it appears to be that they're saying, well, what the FBI is saying makes sense. And, that animal advocates were interested only in, misanthropic behavior and so forth. So we entered a debate with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it turned out to be very interesting. They arrived at a conference. Mark Potok of the Southern Poverty Law Center decided to join us at a conference we had last July. This would be 2005, July. And it was really extraordinary, and I think, preparing for that experience was part of preparing for the book. And I had always been interested in the critique of welfare in the movement. And, of course, Gary Francione has written quite a bit on this. And at one point we taught together, along with Anna Charlton. And so, my background in critiques with the animal movement had to do with looking at welfare and looking at the way activism is co-opted through these concessions with businesses. And I've written about that. But when I started looking at militancy, of course, one of the things that we wanted to make clear was that animal advocates are a really diverse group of people. We don't all think alike. Some of us, it's dangerous when we're all painted with the same brush, I think, because we're such a diverse community, and to the point, I think, where we need to think about this and talk about this and perhaps unify around a certain group of principles. But when I was looking at the militants in the movement, the militancy in the movement, I sensed a pattern that oftentimes the campaigns that were particularly militant are the ones that would be most likely, say, to be critiqued by the general population and lose their support, also happen to be surrounding welfare ideas. So that I hadn't really thought about before. And when I started writing the book, more and more as I was writing, I saw that this was the case. And I don't know if anybody's really looked at that or analyzed that before, not that I know of. So that was something that I started, and sort of to open the dialogue on that issue.
So when you say militant groups or militant actions, what do you mean?
Well, I divide the idea of militancy from radical activism. When I talk about militant welfarism or militant action, militant advocacy, I am talking specifically about a certain kind of activism that will, say, not get the support of the public. And I think if we're going to use the paradigmatic example of that, it would be the Gladys Hammond case. It would be digging up a body in England, the case surrounding a group of family farmers who were supplying guinea pigs to Huntington Life Sciences in England. And for a while, their village came under a campaign by what I would call militant activists. And they weren't all militant activists. Many of them were nonviolent activists that I believe were radical, but not engaged in systematic tactics of intimidation. Some were. A certain subgroup were. And there's no question but that some people in animal advocacy do believe that it is through intimidation that success can be achieved. And it not simply that, there's a variety of tactics that need to be used, but that intimidation is the tactic to use, and I've talked with such people. In any case, eventually, after not stopping the guinea pig breeding operation, as you know, they dug up a body of somebody who had died, who was related. One of the owners of the farm had a mother-in-law who died several years ago and was buried in this gorgeous country churchyard. And the point was apparently to break up the family's consensus on what to do here until they really emotionally broke down and decided to shut the guinea pig farm down. They did. After many moons, the family did shut the guinea pig operation down. Now, this was hailed as a great victory by some. However, I think that a vegan perspective on this would see it quite differently, because what happened at that family farm is that they merely shifted their profit-making enterprise from the guinea pig farming back to the dairy farming, which they had originally done. And I saw almost no notice of this. And that's one of the things I bring up in the book, that the educational idea was missed there. I mean, certainly when the people shut down the operation to breed the guinea pigs, they didn't have an animal rights perspective at that point. They were simply, their family was emotionally exhausted, and they decided, after many months of arguing, well, no, we can't give in to blackmail, and another segment of the family saying, but we want our mother's remains back. Finally, they said, yes, we'll stop it. And what happened was all over the country and beyond, because these were in international web broadcast papers, you saw the sight of the clergy kneeling in front of the grave and begging the activists to please do something good, show some care, show some compassion, show some concern, and please bring the remains of Gladys Hammond back. As you know, yes, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to ask, I do want to return to the whole idea of the ways in which you think some of this activism enforces welfarist mentalities and some of your critiques of welfarism. But I guess I just want to ask about the whole point that you used to kind of define the book. Isn't it, one could say that you're using a really extreme example to kind of paint a whole segment of the animal rights movement in a negative light. How would you respond to that kind of criticism?
Well, yes, that's true. I do bring up an extreme example. However, it is an example around which, there's been quite a lot of support for it, written through the media by, I don't know if all the support of, I've seen it compared to the activism of Nelson Mandela, for example, in the British papers. There is support. There is definitely support for that kind of activity, more so in Britain than here. But part of this is because people don't know about that particular piece of activism here. However, the government, they know. They know, and they see this as an international campaign. They see this as part of the campaign against Huntington Life Sciences. So it's interesting to see the way the government and the public looks at this campaign, not just how activists look at this campaign. I think that's very important. They will pick out the extremes. So I think we need to look at the extremes and find out what they're about, and whether we think that, some of these things have to be done by some. If they're done by the extremists, and yes, they are extreme examples, then that makes the less extreme look good. And the argument is that, there are people out there doing extremists, and that's why the more moderate people succeed. Now, I personally don't believe I am moderate, and I work with a group, Friends of Animals, which I consider radical, and that's why I joined the group. However, the argument is, if you don't agree with it, it's pushing you forward, because it's only the threat of people like that get people to listen to us at all, and that get press.
I want to return to some of these issues, but before we do, I want to make sure that all of our listeners have a pretty clear idea of the argument that you're making in the book. And I think this is one of the more intriguing or interesting parts of the book when I read it, was that essentially you're arguing that first, I would like maybe for you to talk about some of the issues that you see with welfarist activism, but secondly, this is kind of a surprising argument in your book, right? That really what tend to be thought of as the most militant or radical aspects of the movement are actually working from kind of a welfarist philosophy. Can you explain that?
Well, I think let's use Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty on that one, because I know that's one you want to look at. The idea that's usually heard about Huntington is that they've punched puppies, and that they violated the Animal Welfare Act and the counterpart of the Animal Welfare Act in Britain, and they have done that, and they've been fined for it. And at one point, part of their operation was shut down for a short time, and then they had to reform what they were doing so that it was more in line with what the general public thinks is humane. And the idea about the punching of the puppies that's an iconic part of this campaign at this point. And so, I would question, well, is this designed to draw on people's sympathies? I mean, puppies. Nobody likes it when puppies are punched. So they're not picking out all of the animals here, including the rodents. They're specifically picking out generally, these animals who are more charismatic to most people, and the idea that there's this extreme abuse. And so then the question becomes, what is the argument that the activists are putting forth? And it's very hard to tell, and I have read loads on this campaign, and very rarely do I find a hint of a truly well laid out abolitionist argument. Indeed, normally I find things that are very confusing, communications to the public that show anger, but do not deal with the abolitionist idea. So I don't know how much has been learned from this campaign.
Well, isn't one of the arguments, though, that the campaign itself, or any kinds of action like this, increase the costs of doing this kind of business? I mean, I think that's the argument that I've heard from the Shack, is that, if we make it difficult to do this kind of work, fewer and fewer people want to do it. If we raise the costs, if we come out and speak for the voiceless, it will create a situation in which doing this the costs are just way too high.
Yeah, I understand that argument. I'm concerned also that we're raising the costs for activism, for activists, the activist community. There have been countless fundraisers involving Shack, and the restitution here, just the restitution alone, without going into the copious lawyers' fees that are coming out of this case, is, I believe, $1,000,001. So we're looking at, activists paying back to, including to the company. And so that's a concern that goes through my book as well. Well, is there, to some extent, are we dealing with the symptoms in a situation where insurance is going to cover costs, in a situation where animals are generally replaced, in certain circumstances, more animals were used than before? And what is this doing? How is this advancing a movement when so much money is put into this effort? And I know that people have rallied around it, and I understand the motivation for rallying around it. But I think that argument cuts both ways. It's a hell of a lot of money, $1 million, for an activist community. That represents a lot of money that could be used in other ways. So I just want to bring up that argument, can be used against us as well as the industry.
Well, I mean, I understand that argument, but wouldn't one kind of the argument then in response to that be that really the problem that exists with regard to to punishing these activists, I mean, the kinds of sentences they're receiving for the crimes they've committed, it's a direct result of things like the animal enterprises Protection Act and trying and prosecuting under these laws that, you see rapists get less time than some of the folks in the shack. And so I think I certainly understand the critique that you have, right? That $1 million is in fact a lot of money that could be channeled into the community in different ways. But on the other side of it, doesn't it show I think the argument would be that it would show the injustice of the system and why we need to fight against that system that would create these kinds of barriers and challenges to begin with without recognizing the inherent value of animals. So I don't know.
I see what your point is there, and at the same time, there's another question to add to this, and that's that if we want to avoid these more and more draconian types of laws, how do we do that? How do we avoid these? We're seeing one coming up now. This HR 4239, this Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which of course I oppose, and so does everybody at Friends of Animals. But the progressive environmentalist George Monbiot, who writes prolifically for The Guardian and other, in fact has a website in Britain, very well respected writer, says that it has the concern that if the activists become unpopular, there's an effect in the progressive community that many in the progressive community will stand aside as these laws are being forged, and the activist community, the animal community, then becomes some sort of a test ground that's particularly vulnerable if the rest of the progressive community is not completely behind them. And I think we've seen this play out. I'll give you an example of what Monbiot has written in The Guardian and on the Monbiot website. Here's a quote. "The demonstrators who have halted the construction of the new animal testing labs in Oxford command little public sympathy. Their arguments are often woolly and poorly presented. Among them is a small number of dangerous and deeply unpleasant characters who appear to respect the rights of every mammal except Homo sapiens. This unpopularity is a gift to the state. For fear of being seen to sympathize with dangerous nutters, hardly anyone dares to speak out against the repressive laws with which the government intends to restrain them." So you see, as Monbiot points out, the government will seize the opportunity provided to them by apparently dangerous activists to begin treating all kinds of dissenters as terrorists. And this kind of clampdown is taking place all over the world. So again, I think we need to see another, a more multi-dimensional discussion of the question that you bring up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, going back to the other side, then you see the welfarist arguments that sort of represent the turn. Oh, well, then let's work with the corporations to change things. And how do you see the welfarist side as being just as dangerous?
Well, I think, and this is what the book has led me, writing the book, of course, it is an educational experience. I'm sure you know that, being writers yourselves. As you write, the book talks to you as you talk to the pages. And one of the conclusions that I've drawn from the book is I strongly believe now that industry has found two ways to co-opt the animal and environmental movements. And the first way, and I knew this before, and John Stauber has written about it quite a bit, and now I see James Levesque is bringing that out in the Satya magazine. They co-opt activism through concessions, through agreeing, and that's what you're bringing up here. I also think now that they co-opt activism, or they control activism by suggesting to the general public that activists could be dangerous. And we've seen the Wise Use movement, Ron Arnold, who was affiliated with the Wise Use movement and associated with it for many years. I've written about this now for Action Line, our magazine. And Ron Arnold is the person who coins the term eco-terrorist. Now it's all over the place. How did this person manage to do this? There's a great little book, very simple, and a quick read. It's called Divine Destruction, Wise Youth, Dominion Theology, and the Making of American Environmental Policy. And it's by Stephanie Hendricks, and it's published by Melville Manifestos. I cited this several times in my recent writing about Ron Arnold for our magazine. And one of the things that Hendricks points out is that the Wise Youth movement used to be associated with right-wing violence to a certain extent. There were people attracted to the anti-green movement who were prepared to use violence or espouse violence, and to some extent Ron Arnold's rhetoric was terribly provocative. And then came along Oklahoma City. This was 1995, and of course the Murrah Federal Building was bombed, and a horrible outcome of, I think, 168 people died, many people injured, and after that, the government clamped down, and we've seen, what we're seeing right now dates back really to 1996. This phase of anti-terrorism law, and in 1996 there was anti-terrorism law passed. It particularly hit hard against non-citizens because they were the very first people suspected in this case. Not for long, but that didn't keep the legislation from pinpointing non-citizens as particularly vulnerable. And to this day, the anti-immigration sentiment in this country is very well buttressed by the series of laws that was passed in 1996, and this was during Clinton's time. So what Hendricks points out is that immediately after this all happened, the mood of the whole national mood was sensed by Ron Arnold, who then decided to tone down the rhetoric of wanting to kill the environmental movement and kill the bastards and those kinds of phrases. Ron Arnold started saying, well, I just want to destroy the environmental movement. In other words, not people, just the movement. So somehow that was supposed to be more professional. And the people who were following around with the Wise Youth movement learned that they were to become professional and to have a great deal of influence, and they have done. All the little consumer groups that we see that are very much against environmental movements and against nutritional movements, organic movements, they are promoting GMOs and so forth, and they're against animal advocates. These little front groups, and I guess probably the one that everybody knows best is Center for Consumer Freedom. All these little groups now are taking center stage, and they have the ear of legislators, and they have now turned the tables, and they are telling folks, the public, the legislators, that it's the Greens who are dangerous and not themselves. And they've become remarkably successful at this. So you have, my concern on this point is that, when you have a John Lewis who goes in and says, there is nothing else going on in this country that is racking up the high number of violent crimes and terrorist actions, telling James Inhofe, who invited the FBI to speak to the lawmakers. And that same type of point that Lewis is trying to promote, that animal advocates are dangerous, that environmental activists are dangerous, then Jerry Vlasic echoes, coming in saying that there would, quote, would be a morally justifiable solution, unquote, if deadly force were used against scientists who use non-human animals. So you see how that reinforces what John Lewis has just said.
So the whole approach that you're taking essentially is that you think as an entire movement we need to sit down and rethink how we do it. Maybe we have to have a central message or a central set of messages, a central kind of theoretical framework or paradigm from which we all work that would then drive really a more rational, coherent movement that wouldn't work into the hands of those that want to co-opt the movement itself.
Well, I'm suggesting that people think about this. Yes, I realize that there are going to be people who have different ideas, and will continue to disagree with that, both on the welfare point of view and also because and I should say, I shouldn't call it welfare. I don't call it welfare. In the book, I call it husbandry. And at the meeting, the Sacha meeting on the 12th, I heard Farmer Brown stand up and say, farmer activist Brown stand up and say, let's not call it welfare, let's call it husbandry. That's the correct term for it. And already the animal agribusiness knows all about welfare. They don't need any help from any activist community. They teach it in the agricultural schools. So let's call it what it is, husbandry. So I'm concerned and opposed to the husbandry movement, and I'm also critiquing the militancy. And I realize that not everybody will agree with that, but yes, I think that these kinds of things have to be talked about. And if there is a mesh between these two what I believe are disempowering strains in the movement, and I think we have to look at that. I think we have to analyze that, see where we're going. Absolutely. In fact, another thing that I've noticed in the what you're calling extreme militancy is the idea that we have to be vegetarians or vegans. Now, that assumes that not all vegetarians are vegans in the way they're using the word vegetarian. So, in other words, one can eat dairy products, one can eat eggs, and so forth. So here are folks who are, if they espouse the principles which some of the most militant groups have laid out, the guidelines that the militants have laid out, then they're not doing direct action on their own refrigerator at this point. They haven't even got to some basic questions about a long-term vision for the movement, and yet people are going out and suggesting that we use force against property and possibly, in some cases, force against vivisectors.
So let me just clarify that last point, or try to get some clarity there. Are you saying that some folks who are promoting this kind of direct action or militant action are actually not promoting veganism, or not asking people to be vegan? That's
right. Huh. In fact, the guidelines for the ALF, and you'll hear this attributed to Robin Webb as well, and I talk about it in the book as well. The people who are discussing the guidelines for the ALF typically say that the rule starts this way. To be involved with an ALF action, you must be vegetarian or vegan, and then it moves on from there. So this is discussed in depth in the book if people would like to refer to it. But I've seen it commonly, the idea that the militant activist must start out being vegetarian or vegan. This is actually quite common. And I have talked with people who have said, yes, folks that I know who are doing direct action, and of course we could go back to the term direct action, but people who use it in the common sense, direct action, against corporations, against chicken sheds or whatever. Yes, there are folks there who are not vegan. I've heard this commonly throughout the years. I've been in the animal advocacy movement for over 20 years.
But on the flip side of it too, there are also a lot of people who are not even vegetarians that are involved in the kind of, I guess what you would call the kind of husbandry movement, or humane, for a long time within Humane Society and other kinds of organizations. There's almost a complete lack of veganism or vegetarianism. And one of the things that I find really disturbing about all of this is really the kind of absence of veganism as the moral baseline, or kind of the living abolition in your daily life kind of idea, how that's missing from our movement, how I think that's really a necessary ingredient in it. I have to admit, I haven't seen as much of that on the kind of militant side of things. I guess maybe the folks I know I don't really know any militants, but the kind of stuff I read on that tends to have a very different approach to it. But yeah, I think that's one of the things I find very challenging about the kind of new welfarist, or what Francine would call new welfarist or husbandry movement issues.
Yes, this idea that people go out and they do actions. I think generally because there's energy, and the energy has to go somewhere, right? And there's nothing wrong with energy, and certainly it does have to go somewhere. I don't believe in passivity. So then the question becomes, Bob, should we put some of this energy into veganism, into really coming up with some great arguments and ways of going out, doing outreach to the public, and getting the idea out there? And, sometimes people say, well, you can only reach, one person at a time. What kind of an incremental step are you talking about? Because I always say, well, vegan education is an incremental step, because everybody who goes vegan, as you, Bob, I think have pointed out, participates in a revolution in their own life. So this is a great way of incremental activism. But it's also exponential. It's not just incremental, but it's also exponential, because everybody who does this is really energetic to do it in the first place. To think about, I'm going to change my life from the dominant paradigm. I'm going to live in the sort of world I'm going to create right now is going to be, well, animal rights exist. That's how I'm going to live. That vis-a-vis me, animals have rights, because I opt out of exploitation. I think that's a very energetic statement. And people who feel that way, I think, can't help. Most people who feel that way, who do it for ethical reasons, can't help being role models, can't help being people who talk to other people in a really energetic way. Most advocates do.
Yeah, I agree. I see it as extremely contagious. Let's talk a little bit more about that. How do you see, or what does an abolitionist or activism look like to you?
What does activism look like? Well, I would say vegan festivals are excellent. We don't have a lot of those, We have vegetarian festivals with the broad definition of vegetarianism, which I think we should talk about that too in the movement. Why so many activists are accepting the idea that vegetarian can mean with or without the use of eggs or dairy products. That's not the historical meaning of it. And that's just been in the last, say, 30 years or so. I think that mostly it's come into bylaws and so forth of various vegetarian societies. So one idea that I think is great motivation is going around talking to vegetarian activists about veganism, having festivals, having great big parties, bringing all sorts of people who, for all sorts of reasons, have vegan food. I'll give you an example of the London Vegan Festival, which I think is quite interesting. There are people from all sorts of movements. They're not necessarily just from the animal movement, and yet everybody talks together, so they see how all these ideas connect. So there'll be people from even the religious movements. There'll be people who come because they've cured their cancer, and with raw food diet, and that's how they feel. The Festival of Life, the people from the Festival of Life who do raw foods. In their opinion, their cancer was cured by a raw food diet. Who am I to disagree with them if that was their life experience? And they are making this wonderful food and sharing it with everybody. So there's music, and there are speakers, and there's dancing and that sort of thing. And I think those are the kinds of things we would enjoy doing more. I even think theater. I mean, I saw this fantastic show called Playhouse Creatures recently, and I thought, what a great piece of vegan activism or animal rights activism that would be, because it was talking about when the first women took the stage, because for a long time only male actors could be on the stage, and here is the moment when the very first female actors, because some member of the royalty decided that they were waiting too long for men to put on makeup or shave. And they said, let's just have the women get on stage. And when they did, these very first women, very first female actors, they got on stage, and it was clear that the whole point was prurient interest. The whole point, the reason they were there at the beginning was because they were showpieces. And it was highly sexualized. And one of them said, and this is a true story, and one of the elder actors said to the rest, well, this stage, this was owned by my father, and he had a show of dancing bears. And one day, one of the bears, she got up and assaulted the keeper. I suppose it was probably her father, the person who was running the dancing bear show. The bear attacked, and what happened to the bear? Well, her claws were pulled out, and her teeth were removed. And the daughter said, I could remember, I saw the bear curl up in the most extraordinary pain, and I heard her wailing, her crying all night. But my father said, you have to do it now or the rest of them won't continue to dance. So this idea, I thought, the way this connects the various hierarchies, the various forms of oppression we deal with, and connects it to something like that, I think the audience was amazed, because here they thought they were going to come and see this bawdy show about these first women actors, and it was advertised with a corset with 2 oranges on the top. That was what the posters, they were all over the city. This was in London. And the way people were attracted was this idea of sexuality. And I almost didn't go because of that. I thought it was just going to be, very sexual, very ha-ha, this is how it was type of thing. And there was going to be very little social commentary. But I was totally wrong. And I thought, how do these people feel when they see this connection with the bears? There was complete silence. And I was just imagining being in the minds of this audience. So, to answer your question, I think there are so many creative ways that we could put our energies into something that really makes a huge impact.
What you were just talking about actually raises a point for me. When I was reading your book, you have a very powerful critique of hierarchy and domination in the book, and what you just brought up, touches into the question of shared oppressions. And I was wondering if maybe you could discuss some of your thoughts on kind of how some activism tends to reify what you see as problematic hierarchy and domination, and how we need to go about kind of breaking some of that down within the movement.
Yes, well, I don't go into, as you know, any kind of detailed economic analysis, or really any kind of detailed class analysis or anything like that. I basically stick to the most broad brush on that, and just to get the idea across that people, it's a short book, by the way, and the chapters are very short, and once I got past 12 or 13 pages on any chapter, my first rule was I wasn't going to go past 10. But as it turned out, I believe the longest chapter in there is about 15 pages. And when I got beyond that point, I just cut things off. So when I read the book, I have in mind all these other ideas that I had put in there and just cut off, because that was my rule. The chapters were going to be short. I was just going to bring some ideas and let people think from there and let the arguments move on from there. Mm-hmm. But one thing I did want to bring up is this idea that as activists, the importance of not replicating the same sort of dynamic of domination that I hope, that we've come to question. And certainly the vegan movement, founded in 1944, certainly that was very important, that idea that the animals, the other animals of the world, were not to be exploited, they were not to be dominated. Donald Watson's idea of war against the animals, I find is very, very interesting. This war, this idea that there's the other, and that we make war on the other so that we can control the other, we can dominate the other. And I would hate to see this reflected we all grow up in a hierarchical society where domination and often violence is seen as the solution when something's really, really, really important. And I think it's hard for us to step back and question that and say, well, there may be ways of doing things that as we do them, in other words, the means to our end, could reflect the sort of end we want to see, and that's an egalitarian end. And I think that's a lot to bring up to people, and myself. So it's certainly more of the beginning of that conversation than the end, as far as I'm concerned. There were loads of things I didn't do in the book, For example, I didn't give any sort of guidelines, which I thought would work out for activists. And people have said, oh, why, I feel so lost at the end of this. It's great, but, when I get to the end of it, I don't know what to do. And that's the point. I thought it would be a bit peculiar to write all this stuff about domination and hierarchy, and then at the end of it sort of pretend to hand down something.
Well, actually, that makes a lot of sense, too, because I don't think any single person can actually decide to use kind of a shorthand, what the revolution should look like.
Sure.
I think we all need to decide as a group or as groups of people.
Sure. And the other thing I think is at the end of it, I wanted people to, and this has happened, I wanted people to sort of have a confused pause. Mm-hmm. Like, where do we go from here? Because I think that makes sense. I don't think we've really thought about a lot of these things, about domination, and certainly not as a movement. I mean, we haven't really talked about some of these issues. And basically the idea has been so far, go out and do this. Just do something. Just do it. Do it for the animals. And in the case of the organized welfare, professionalized welfare or husbandry groups, we've seen, click here or donate here. And so this sort of immediate, let's do something, whatever it is, because all these sorts of things are needed. So it doesn't matter what you do, just go out and do it. And I see that very strongly in the husbandry movement, and I see it very strongly in the militancy movement. So I don't think we've really talked about these fundamentals. And at the end of it, I think this is how I felt at the end of it. And somebody has asked me this in these exact words. What do you see as the vision? What do you see as where we're going? How do we go from here? What kind of society is it exactly that we want? How can our efforts best be used? If we're going to spend our mental resources, our psychological resources, our monetary resources, our time, what do we do, and how do we get to that goal? I love that question. What would a non-hierarchical society look like? Do we have any idea? How can we? So at the end of it, just sort of imagining, this creative visualization idea, imagining what if the world can survive global warming. Part of it, I think, is veganism. I think we have to have veganism to have environmental and social survival, really. But at the same time, we're looking sort of this long-term idea. What will it look like to get something that will be the first civilization that merits the name? And once we figure out, we'll say, how it would look like in a few generations. We don't know, really, what a few generations of veganism will do. But say we write that down and we have this mental idea. All right, great, then what do we do in our lifetimes to get there? And then say, what do we do in the next 10 years? What does our organization want to do in the next, then, 5 years? What should we be doing this year? And so here's a movement that would have this game plan. And that's something, of course, that we all need to talk about. I really think that Satya magazine, in the last couple of issues, has touched on this in a way that should be really supported strongly and praised.
Absolutely.
What they've done, very brave.
Yeah, I agree. I was just going to say that I see one of the places where the conversation is really started and hopefully will continue is in Satya magazine, and I think they've done a really good job in opening up the questions that we really need to be talking about, like you just said. And they recently had a forum, humane meat discussion. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the issues that came up in that discussion?
Yes, I can. I was there. You were in upstate New York.
Yeah, we were a good 6 or 7 hours away, so we couldn't make it.
And I know you were invited because you've been wonderful participants in the Satya magazine on this very discussion.
Thanks.
Well, what happened is, and of course this is my perspective, my limited perspective, but this is what I saw. We started off. Kat Klein gave a nice introduction, and so did the person who directs. There were a few people from the yoga studio. It was a great way to do this because the yoga studio has a calming sort of atmosphere. We really needed that. There was a nice herbal tea. And they talked a little bit about there's sort of this idea, this meditation idea at the beginning, very brief, but it was a great idea because I think we did get through it. There were some heated moments. I'll acknowledge that myself, I had a few heated moments, and I try not to, because normally I think you're familiar with Dr. Michael Clapper and some of the talks that Dr. Clapper has given. One of the things that Michael Clapper pointed out is this sort of this feeling of veganism in your everyday life, in your everyday interactions, is sort of modeling a peace movement. So, in other words, if somebody ahead of you isn't moving fast enough, you don't necessarily have to honk. You'll get there. There's room enough in the world for both of us. And I thought this was really helpful because now I'm starting to think of what I do in my life, my daily interactions, and I tend to be sort of hot-headed. So the idea of, okay, be calm, listen to everybody. Everybody has everybody should be respected, and try to sort of go through the meeting without getting perturbed. And I'm becoming better and better at that every day. But I have to tell you, there were some moments in this meeting where, for example, John Mackey was described as a vegan. and I just, I have to say, I had to get up at that moment. John Mackey, of course, isn't a vegan.
No.
So the idea that, well, isn't it wonderful that the animal advocacy movement has prevailed upon this person who's a vocal pro-capitalist, international meat marketer and also a purveyor of goat cheese, that happens. I think that's the big favorite in the John Mackey diet is goat cheese, because not only do we hear that Mackey eats it, but they sure have a big section of it when you walk into these various places. So it sort of, the interior reflects this person's tastes, I assume, because that's one thing we always hear, that John Mackey does have a penchant for goat cheese.
On the subject of Mackey, though, I don't mean to interrupt, but it's actually really relevant, because in that same in the most recent Satya magazine, there's also what Peter Singer has characterized as kind of a middle finger letter to Friends of Animals. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, because for those that don't know, the letter is Peter Singer and, I don't know, a whole list of animal advocacy groups coming out and saying that they support Whole Foods' fine standards for, pioneering standards, I think they're called, for dealing with animals in agricultural production. I find it very Orwellian that we have animal advocacy groups, kind of promoting the consumption of animals, but Peter Singer's very clear in the interview that this is meant to marginalize Friends of Animals, and I'm wondering what you think of that idea.
Well, the way it worked was when we first heard about the Animal Compassion Foundation, which was obviously going to be a selling point for Whole Foods Market, and a way for them to say that they were involved in social responsibility, we protested about it, particularly because John Mackey was saying, I'm a vegan, and people were saying, oh, well, why don't you pick on Safeway or some other place where they sell, and they don't even try. Well, that's the point. They don't say that they're somebody they're not. And so we felt that Mackey was speaking or purporting to speak for us, because here's somebody who's saying, well, I'm a vegan, and, I'm going to do this. Well, they hired an expert in agribusiness, Anne Malot, to direct this foundation, and immediately Whole Foods stock hit a record high. We're talking about the next day. And then they said, well, we're going to have the final Tuesday in January of 2005, and we're going to have people go in there, and with silhouettes of a bird, a pig, and a cow. So it was oriented to the meat idea, what they call humane meat. And the idea was go in and support Whole Foods Market, and we'll put money into this foundation. And then what are we going to do with the money? We're going to open a library where we'll have information about how to handle animals humanely for agribusiness. Well, at that point, when we heard about this day, we decided we were going to distribute information at 5 Whole Foods locations and ask shoppers to reconsider the idea of funding a concept that would promote research, on animals and agribusiness, and that would promote this unveiling of yet another line of animal products. And Priscilla Farrell, who's the president of Friends of Animals, wrote to CEO John Mackey. Mackey had said, what matters most is the quality of life we and farm animals have when they're alive. And Priscilla Farrell wrote back, no, John. What matters most here is that we have the ability to decide whether to keep bringing other animals into existence simply to be sold as food, while using up land and water resources that could be left to animals who could really have full and free lives. So at that point, now you see there's not everybody's in line here with the idea of this compassion. Now they wanted to say, the grocers wanted to say that everybody was. In fact, that animal rights people were behind, were supporting this, and we said no. So at that point, there was a letter generated by a group called Animal Rights International. The head of this is Peter Singer, and the letter was signed by Peter Singer. It was co-signed by 17 animal protection groups, and the name of the letter was Animal Rights Groups Express Support for Animal Compassion Foundation. It was signed by the Animal Welfare Institute, Animal Place, the Animal Protection Institute, AVAR, which is the Veterinarians Association, several local groups, Compassion Over Killing, Farm Sanctuary, Mercy for Animals, Vegan Outreach, and several groups that had been in the very beginning in December 2003 were involved in an early meeting on this, including Viva USA, the Animal Welfare Institute, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and the Humane Society of the United States. Now, in the meeting the other day, this was the 12th of October, you're talking about what the meeting was called the Humane Meat Discussion. That's why I'm using the phrase humane meat. Gene Bouston acknowledged, now this is now late 2006, mind you, there are still no actual compassion standards in place. Nevertheless, in London, and I talked about this at the meeting, there's a brand new Whole Foods market. It's actually the first one that Mackey is naming Whole Foods Market, as far as I know. To date, what Mackey has done is taken over Fresh and Wild, an organic chain. And so Whole Foods Market controls the chain Fresh and Wild. But now, in the most expensive part of London, at the site of Barker's of Kensington, which was London's oldest and most elegant department store, we're now going to have the first Whole Foods Market. And there's a huge, big billboard, massive. This is like the site of a museum, and it's across from Hyde Park. Very expensive area, very high-profile area. And this huge billboard touts their social responsibility, and of course part of that is their Global 5% Day, and they make that obvious. So this is a way that they're signaling the shopping community of London that you come here and you'll have this great social responsibility and you can buy whatever it is. And of course part of that is the idea of humane meat. They didn't have that before at Fresh and Wild. They have that now. The way the Guardian Observer wrote when about Mackey's appearance in England, they wrote, "Sausages made from humanely treated animals." Now, the irony here is that Fresh and Wild has a fantastic line of vegan sausages, and they're not selling them at Whole Foods Market in North America. And they're absolutely the best I've ever tried. I hope they come here, and we certainly don't want to in any way diminish their chances with getting in with Whole Foods Market, because I know that Whole Foods Market controls the organic and the vegetarian distribution to a great extent, and they're going to make a decision about this product. But anyway, it's called Redwood Whole Foods Company, and they make the best vegan sausages if you're into that sort of thing.
And they make Cheesely.
You got it. Oh, you know about it. Oh, yeah. God, it's fantastic. So what Gene Bouston said at this meeting was, well, nobody was promoting, endorsing humane meat. Now you heard what the letter said. You heard what the letter was the headline of it, and it used the word support. And James Levesque of Tribe of Heart got up and read from the letter itself. By the way, it's in Sacha magazine. And the letter that's signed by Singer and co-signed by 17 groups says, it starts out like this: Dear John, the undersigned animal welfare, animal protection, and animal rights organizations would like to express their appreciation and support for the pioneering initiative being taken by Whole Foods Market in setting farm animal compassionate standards. Now, Levesque then asked, could anyone get up, please, and argue that this was anything other than an endorsement? There was silence in the room for about a minute. Nobody could or would reply that it was anything other than an endorsement.
Yeah.
So I said, well, okay. So first, there's the question about the personal veganism. Is Mackey eats animal products? But then there's this idea, as a significant international marketer of animal secretions and flesh, how can Mackey possibly claim to be striving to opt out of agribusiness, which is what a vegan does? This notion of, I don't sell prostitutes, I don't sell them. I don't use the prostitutes, I just sell them. What is the word for that in the English language? And in fact, we had talked earlier in the meeting, about sex slaves in Eastern Europe and the United States. And people were talking about the use of individuals for their body, the complete commodification of individuals for their body. We talked about it earlier in the same meeting. So then, this idea that Mackey's a vegan, and there were people, at least one person, prepared to continue to insist on that at this meeting. And so the question was, well, what do you call somebody I don't eat them, I just sell them?
Yeah, I mean, if you make a profit on the exploitation and suffering of animals, I don't think you can rightly call yourself a vegan. It violates what I would think would be one of the tenets of veganism. But I suppose that the way in which our choices are so individualized, there's some way in which logically, illogically, one could argue this, but I don't even see how it could be argued with the case of John Mackey. And also, you mentioned earlier that he's so pro-capitalist and also quite anti-union, or at least he has espoused those kinds of positions. I find it very difficult to believe that, he's vegan for anything more than what would, you can maybe argue health reasons or perhaps as a marketing reason.
Yes, great point. I'm going to be writing more about that. One of my favorite publications, as you probably know, is Dissident Voice. By the way, talk about a publication that goes all over. You would love it because there's so many parts of the various radical spectrum. There are so many ideas about how to change society in that magazine, and I think it's an online magazine, and I think it's fantastic that they are inviting the animal rights argument into that magazine, Dissident Voice. So that's one of the things they do a lot on serious grassroots change in the hierarchy department. They're very keen on this.
Excellent.
And so the idea that Mackey, as somebody who's decided that corporations are the answer for workers, for animals, this idea that if workers are going to get respect and non-humans are going to get respect, the way they're going to get it is corporations are going to give it to them.
Yeah, it's baffling to me. Absolutely baffling. I suppose we should probably start calling this a close. You're probably quite tired because we've really been putting you through the paces here. And
well, it's delightful. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
your questions are great, and this stuff. I just get energized talking about this stuff.
Well, that's good to hear, actually, because we've enjoyed talking with you. But before we pull it to a close, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we head out? Any other issues that you'd like to discuss?
Well, I guess I'd like to, now that you ask me, end it on something that Donald Watson said in an interview shortly before, well, you know that Donald Watson recently passed away.
Right.
At the age of 95, after being an official vegan since 1944, but of course before that. And so this was certainly a great, here's a person who really did self-experiment, did the experiments on oneself, which is the moral way to do it, I think, and proved that you could do it. And so Donald Watson was asked by an interviewer several years back, well, now the millions of people who are now vegan, do you have any messages for them? And Watson said, oh, yes, take the broad view of what veganism stands for. It's the new recipe for a substitute for scrambled eggs. Yes, it's a new recipe for cake. But it's so much more. Take the broad view of what it stands for. And Donald Watson had talked so much about conscientious objection, being both a conscientious objector to the war at the time, and that was about as rough as you can do it. I mean, if you're going to, in 1944, be a conscientious objector, you really mean business. And, here's a person who said, the idea, the way to change the world is to opt out of this idea that some can be used for the purpose of others. And Watson was very clear. It's the family farm is no better. The idea that other animals were put on this earth to have their days numbered by their usefulness to humanity, that's just not right, Donald Watson said. It was the family farm and the experiences on the family farm that caused Donald Watson to see it this way. So this idea of take the broad view. Obviously, Watson saw veganism as more than a diet, but as a whole way of changing social change, an entire social movement. I think that's fantastic that we have somebody like that to look to.
Absolutely.
That's a wonderful note to end on.
It is indeed. So,
thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Bob.
One quick thing here. If people want to find your book, they can get it on Amazon. And where else can it be found?
Can I say this? Avoid Amazon. Don't tell Amazon I said that, okay?
Well, no, they're corporate.
But the reason I'm saying that is if you want to support the movement, I'd suggest that buy it through a small local bookshop. You can write to me at Lee Hall at friendsofAnimals.org to know where to order it. The other way of doing it, that we just went on a book tour. We have a cookbook. We have a vegan cookbook as well. So Priscilla Farrell and I just went on a book tour, bringing this all together with the theme of veganism as direct action. And we talked about both the cookbook and the book Capers in the Churchyard. And all these little bookshops, they treat you so marvelously, and they give back to the community economically. So I'd urge people to go to their little bookshops, ask for it there, and get it there. And as I said, I can give examples of somebody who writes. But also, you can buy it through Friends of Animals. We have a store there. And it may be a little bit more money than you can usually get it on Amazon, but at least, you're supporting the movement by doing it. I don't get any proceeds. There are no royalties in this. And you also can have a free membership if you would like to go with the book. It's part of getting the book, because the book is part of a movement.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being on the show. We will make sure to post links to everything in the show notes, so any of our listeners don't have to be scribbling things down. They can just run to our show notes and check it out. And we'd like to encourage everyone to read your book, because it is a very provocative book. So, Lee, thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
That was our interview with Lee Hall.
We want to thank Lee once again for speaking with us.
Absolutely. And I also like to thank Noah, who works with Friends of Animals, for helping get us all in touch and sort everything out. Because I know he listens to the show.
Oh, wonderful.
I think he does anyway, because I say things on the show and sometimes I get little emails or something. So, well, anyway, even if he doesn't, I want to thank him anyhow. It doesn't like he has to listen to the show in order for me to thank him. So,
of course,
if someone doesn't listen to the show and you thank them, are they still thanked?
I think so.
Okay, good. So anyway, that interesting things going on there. Like we said at the beginning of the show, if you have any comments, podcast@veganfreak.com. You can call our voicemail line at
267-295-1944.
Or you can send audio comments to bob@rjtorres.net. You can send up to 100 megabytes there if your email will let you send that much. Most won't.
Is that the right address?
Yes, it is.
Oh.
It's a different...
Okay.
You think I don't know what I'm talking about?
No, never mind. Or you can participate in discussions on our forums.
Yep.
If you're a member on our forums.
Yep.
And there are a lot of ways to get in touch, so let's continue the conversation.
Yeah, so next week, Gary Francione, be ready, do your homework. I would like you to read Introduction to Animal Rights, Your Child or Dog, and also, actually, I think everyone should read Rain Without Thunder.
Yes.
I really think everyone should read that book. And it's just an essential book to read because it deals with the problems of our movement today and why we don't really even have a cogent movement.
And interestingly enough, written 10 years ago.
Sadly.
Yes.
So on that note, we'll talk to you next week.
All right, bye. Hey, Jenna, apparently you have mail.